Yep, that pops up. I wonder if you wait a couple of minutes. I know we've got quite a few people coming, and I see there are currently 4 online, including you and I. So it might be worth just pausing for a minute to allow for variation in clocks. Oh, all of a sudden. Yeah, okay. Welcome, everyone. Just for those who joined and are waiting, we're just waiting a couple of minutes, and then we'll get started. Tony's going to kick us off shortly. So yeah, and just a note again that we are recording this session to make available to those who aren't able to attend. We kick off. Tony, what do you say?
Sounds good to me. Cool. Okay. Firstly, just like to welcome everyone for making the time to come here today. I appreciate that there's going to be a bit of confusion about what this is all about, or some apprehension and stuff. And this meeting is really here to address any concerns that you may have, to answer or to get a better understanding for you on the what, the how, the when, and the why of what this all means. There was a brief introduction that was provided in the email that Fraser sent out. I don't plan on, given the time, going through it in any great detail, because it will be answered through there in finer detail. So that's really the intro of as far as I wanted to go. Fraser, is there anything else you wanted to add at the beginning?
No, I guess just that we are beginning a process. We won't necessarily have all the answers, albeit that I think we have a pretty good sense that this is a complex space, and that we are really going to need to lean very heavily on the experience and expertise of the brand owners that we're engaging, and to a very wide degree, this will be a collaborative exercise that we will need to sort of work together to navigate this space. And just by way of introduction, obviously, Agricovery's role has been for many years to operate product stewardship schemes within the rural sector, with a focus on agrichemicals in the containers. So it's a fairly natural extension, given that veterinary medicines are closely tied in that space, to go into that new area, at least new for Agricovery. My role is I've been working with Agricovery for quite a few years. I undertook the New Zealand Rural Waste Minimisation Project for Environment Canterbury and the Ministry for the Environment. So I spent a few years heavily involved in the rural waste space, and wrote a pretty extensive range of reports looking at how we can best address persistent rural waste issues, and have continued to work with Agricovery as they've moved into a regulated, or moving into a regulated product stewardship space. My expertise is in sort of the development of the models and the systems to make these things work. And so I've been engaged to help sort of guide and facilitate this process into existence, to make for a smooth transition for the med sector into this kind of product stewardship. So I will, hopefully this will work. I have a PowerPoint that'll sort of guide us through the discussion, and I will do my very best to share this successfully, and hope it works. So please do just nod if you can see here what I'm trying to show you. Right, there we go. So that should work. So just nod if you can see a PowerPoint screen. Great, thank you. See you nodding there. So I'm just going to walk you through kind of the process and a bit of a primer on what regulated product stewardship is, where it comes from, what it means, what the implications of it are, some of the design criteria that we need to bear in mind as we move forward and design a scheme, and also the specific work that we're looking to do that's being led by Agricovery in the space. Just to kick off with a reminder, and I'm sure you and your roles will be over this perhaps even more than I am. Obviously, when we bring most of the major brand owners in a space like this together, it starts to make the spines of lawyers tingle. So I do just would remind you, as we will in every meeting of this kind, just to be aware of antitrust concerns, just to be careful about when we come to the Q&A session a little bit later, about what you share about market shares, capacity output, all those sorts of things. I'll certainly keep an ear out for it. If there's anything that seems untoward, I'll draw to a close pretty quickly. But we just want to keep everything above board and not do anything that looks like we are trying to be collusive or anything like that. So just to be aware of those restrictions and the Commerce Act and what it dictates to us. This is, of course, if one looks at the guidelines that we'll discuss shortly, this is specifically mentioned that when one brings everyone together in an industry like this, there are pretty seriously as to why we're here, what we're looking at, and what has changed. And so everything that we're talking about is within the context of the Waste Minimisation Act 2008. It is actually a reasonably concise and readable bit of legislation. So if you want to drill down on this a little bit more, you can just look up the Act and read it, and it's reasonably easy to follow. It's been around, obviously, for 13 years, and within it has always been this ability for the Minister for the Environment to signify certain products as priority products. There's some qualifications for that, particularly those that cause significant environmental harm, and those that would really benefit, in their view, from a product stewardship scheme being in place. in about mid-2019, the industry was given a signal from government that they were planning to declare the first list of priority products. It included things like tyres and single-use plastics is probably the most prominently known one. And then a number of other categories for which product stewardship was already in some sort of state of delivery. There was a pretty wide public consultation, which caused some quite material change to what the guidelines for a product stewardship scheme look like. And in my view, at least, I'm a lawyer by training, so I go through these things with a fine-tooth comb. What they came back with was a drastic improvement on the first run, and we end up with some guidelines that we'll talk through that are actually quite good, quite workable. And so in July, interestingly, you'll see in various communications from me, it references August 2020. It was actually August, but the Gazette seems to have been redated July. I don't know why that is. So for the first time, a list of products was declared as priority products, and that included agrichemicals and their containers. I've put here verbatim from the declaration, and I can certainly provide this to anyone who wants it, what the definition includes, and there's a couple of things there to note, and that it containers up to and including 1,000 litres, or the dry good equivalent, so that usually means 1,000 kilograms. And there's a whole bunch of lists, but right at the top is horticultural, agricultural, and livestock production, including veterinary medicines. Now, one of the things that we'll come to is exactly what does veterinary medicines cover. And as with a number of things in what the government has delivered, we don't have all the detail. One of the early questions about this was, does this extend to small pet kind of veterinary medicines? I think we can probably lead the Ministry for the Environment on that to some degree. And I think the definition attaching itself to livestock production here probably indicates that that's not the intention. That it is kind of the commercial space. But once again, we will seek, once we've assembled the group, we will seek some guidance from government on that. I would also draw your attention to the last paragraph there. It includes, but it's not limited to all those substances that require registration under the Agrecovery Act. So that's a good source for us of determining both the products that are to be focused on, and also gives us some sense as to who will probably bear in the supply chain the responsibility for this. It is likely to be the registrant on the ACVM register, although once again we will seek clarification on that as we proceed. So that's the definition that's been put out by government. The effect of that declaration as of July 2020 is that it then enables the Governor-General, Bowler and Council to make regulations that would, there are a number of effects, but the one that probably has most impact for us is that it would prohibit the sale of a priority product, in this case agrochemicals, except in accordance with an accredited scheme, which means if once a scheme is out there and regulated, that the only way to legally sell the products that are described is in accordance with the accredited scheme. That means following the processes, the procedures, the rules that scheme lays out, and particularly it means adding a levy, in all likelihood, adding a levy to the product and paying that levy into the scheme for the purposes of funding waste disposal and recycling. So that's the big impact. I was on a meeting with MFE yesterday. We were inquiring as to what the likely compliance procedures around this will be, and they said, it's the first time I heard this, that any sale of a product that is not in accordance with the scheme will attract a $100,000 fine. That was the first time I'd heard that number mentioned, but I certainly got the impression they're planning to take this very seriously, and it would not be unexpected were they to make examples of a few non-compliant operators at some point. So it's pretty serious business. In addition to the declaration that lists the priority products, which came out in July 2020, the government also gazetted guidelines, and this is within the structure of the Waste Minimisation Act, where they say, here is what we expect from a product stewardship scheme. Here are the design criteria as you go and put a product stewardship scheme together, which is pretty helpful. It sort of gives a checklist of the things that need to be built into a product stewardship scheme. So you're sort of not starting from a blank sheet of paper. But it's worth noting that this is not regulated in the same way. There is the potential to deviate from those design guidelines, but the process is fairly convoluted, and one would need to get specific Waste Advisory Board approval, and one would suggest have a pretty good reason to deviate from that. But that's worth keeping in our mind. If there is some aspect that is just unworkable in the guidelines, there is the ability to deviate in a probably minor way. So let's talk about the guidelines to give you an idea of what this product stewardship scheme is going to look like, particularly if you're unfamiliar with what Agricovery looks like. I've completed the process of evaluating Agricovery and its process to meet these guidelines, and for them they are fairly minor changes. So Agricovery, if you're familiar with it, is largely structured in accordance with the guidelines. It is based on a lot of industry consultation. They went through a fairly broad approach on this. In my view, that the guidelines are fairly commercially pragmatic. They're not as onerous or restrictive as they might have been, but they also are reasonably prescriptive, and they are looking to see actual product stewardship. They do, for example, preclude simply a user pays, an optional user pays service, which some of us might like to see in place, but they are quite prescriptive to that the costs of collection will be built into the product, and so they are looking to see genuine, authentic product stewardship that has a wide-reaching impact. The way that the schemes have to be governed and their transparency to users, to consumers, in terms of pricing and levies and all that sort of thing is also a big emphasis. So one needs to be fairly open booked about how the scheme operates. Obviously, Agricovery is stepping forward into the space, both based on its representation. Agricovery is governed by a representative board that includes Horton NZ and Dairy NZ and Big Farmers and another number of other representatives. So it is fairly well placed to extend its reach into the vet meds place. It has the structures, and I've done quite a bit of research on Agricovery's behalf, and one of the consistent themes that comes through from those in the rural sector is we want to deal with as few organisations as possible, and hence we're sort of starting with the view that Agricovery would be an appropriate mechanism to operate the scheme, but of course we'll discuss that as we go along. So I'll just give you a brief overview of the guidelines. I can give you a link, or if you simply Google priority product guidelines, you will find the gazetted guidelines quite easily. Again, they're not terribly long, and they're divided into two categories. The first is around product stewardship scheme effects. So this tells you, as you design a product stewardship scheme, kind of what is it, how is it meant to operate? And so right at the front is a circular economy focus, looking for continuous improvement in how the scheme operates and the service that it provides. It's quite user-facing, and it has the overall goal of avoiding environmental harm and capturing as much of the waste as possible. But it also extends out into what they refer to as the waste hierarchy, which really means setting up mechanisms to promote designing out waste and thinking about packaging choices and anything that can be done up the supply chain to avoid waste being created in the first place. Again, that's not an onerous requirement. I think that the realities of being a relatively small country that's often a minor market for some of the products is understood, but it's about building that into the scheme to try and avoid those issues before they're created. And likewise, part of the role of the product stewardship scheme is to explore ways to reduce the onerous nature of waste and simplify the process. The second point, internalise end-of-life costs, and this is probably, as we go, one of the areas that we will spend the most time on. But simply it means that the costs of operating the scheme, its overheads, collection costs, processing costs, disposal costs, whatever, need to be met by product or producer fees. And what that basically means is all products within the scheme would need to be levied in some way, such that the costs are built into the purchase price of a product. The intention there, and the reason this is regulated, is it means that everyone needs to participate, and the fees are fair across the board, so that there is not a competitive distortion, so that it's a completely level playing field. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the complexities in those fees, but it is intended that it's not a blanket fee, but that the fees actually reflect the cost or complexity involved in the disposal of a product. So if you have a product or you have packaging that is very difficult to do anything with, that's likely to attract, or it's intended that it attracts a higher fee than a product that's very easy to recycle. That's built into the wording of that requirement. The second part of that is that users are offered a free and convenient collection. So at some level, at least, a free service has to be provided to the users. Now, that does not mean, as we've pursued this in other areas, it does not mean that you can provide an additional paid add-on service, but that you have to offer a meaningful, and convenient free service. To give a specific example of that, with an Agricovery, they will provide a free drop-off. You can bring your chemicals and containers to an event and bring them yourself, drop them off for free. You can also access the service to have them picked up from the farm, but you have to pay for that, and that's legitimate within this guideline. The other one that I suspect is going to, if this is anything like other types of agrichemicals, is going to stimulate some healthy discussion, is that it is the intention of the guidelines that the industry take responsibility for legacy and orphan products. It's hard to avoid the conversations about inequity on that, particularly where you are forced to grapple with products from brand owners or manufacturers that may have gone out of business some time ago. But some way or another, we need a mechanism to deal with those products that are out there that need to be disposed of, for which a levy has not been charged, or for which the brand owner or manufacturer is no longer around. It's a tough call. It's not easy, but we need to think through that. Next one, public accountability. So we need to provide clear information about how everything works, how the levy is calculated, all that sort of thing. High degree of transparency is required, not just at point of sale or for users, but in terms of the chain of custody and what happens to materials, again, very open book, very, a great emphasis on integrity and ethical behaviour in relation to waste. And I think that's probably for everyone's benefits. And that means also publishing quite a bit of information publicly, and being open about what's being done, what's been collected, and what's happening to it. And then finally, there's an emphasis on efficiency in the form of collaboration. So finding other product stewardship schemes in related industries, and partnering with them where practical and useful to take advantage of the existing infrastructure. That, of course, given that this has been initiated by Agricovery, is kind of built in from the start. That's the intention, is that a lot of the costs that would be involved in setting up a brand new scheme are kind of already absorbed into the fact that Agricovery's systems and network is already up and running. So we're kind of ahead of the game there. So that's the first section, is the scheme effects. And then we come on to the second section. Oh, sorry, I've let the head here. I've already covered that. We come on to the second section, which is the scheme contents. And this talks more about how the scheme is structured. And it's really just these, I'll just check before I say that. Yes, there's 3 key points. The first is governance, which fundamentally follows on with that same theme of transparency and accountability. So it is the intention of the guidelines that the scheme is operated by a non-profit that is competitively neutral, that is not looking to make a profit on the operation of the scheme, so to sort of take it out of that competitive space, and kind of everything that comes from that. So a lot of best practice and due process in terms of operation and performance and reporting, and how directors or boards are appointed. All of that comes along with that. And then notably, it is the intention that for each product category, there is a single scheme. So the guidelines are suggesting that we don't want a whole bunch of schemes, one that causes consumer confusion, given the size of the country, that's likely to result in greater overall costs. So that's sort of built in. That extends down into scheme operations. So having open processes for appointing contractors, ensuring everyone is trained properly and operating a scheme that is professional and appropriate. Again, most of that is fairly intuitive and doesn't cause issues. And then finally, setting targets. So being very performance oriented, setting targets that may be around volumes or growth or percentage of products into the market that are recovered, reporting those publicly and reviewing them every 3 years. So that's, those are summary statements, but in fact, the guidelines aren't extensively more detailed than that, to be honest. Again, you could read them probably in 10 minutes, but it gives you a sense, I think, of what government is looking like. What this is our goal in setting up a scheme, is we've got to make sure all these boxes are ticked. Once again, I think that Agricovery leading the charge does help with quite a few of them. It is a non-profit layer that helps avoid some of the issues that government is avoiding. But once again, we'll want to discuss that when we come together as an advisory group. The other part that the guidelines talk about, actually right at the front, are the time frames. And whereas I said the guidelines were pretty well written, the time frame parts of it are a little bit more ambiguous. So as you can see there, the first time frame says if you've got a scheme already pretty much in place covering the product category, you've got a year from the declaration, which was July 2020, to get the scheme up to the guidelines. And then it says, this is where you've got to do a bit of creative interpretation. It says you have 1 year from the date of the priority product declaration, or when co-design, that's the process that we're going through, co-design recommendations are given to the government, whichever is later, for product categories not substantially covered by a voluntary scheme, for which a co-design process has commenced, or within 3 years from the date of priority product declaration for all other categories. Now, it's reasonably likely that we fall in the second category, although once again, we will confirm this with government very shortly. What the second category essentially says, what would be relevant to us, is that you have a year, once you've designed the scheme, you have a year to then accredit. What that second category does not give us any time frame at all as to how long you can spend designing the scheme, which seems rather remiss. In principle, one could spend 10 years designing the scheme. I don't think that's intended. And as these timeframes are rather ambiguous, we will seek guidance. But in every conversation that we've had with MFE so far, they've been pretty reasonable in terms of timeframes. The focus is on a well-designed, sustainable scheme rather than a scheme that necessarily rushes to the start line. So we want to move with urgency, and that's probably driven by your own requirements as much as it is by government. We want to move forward quickly, but we probably don't have to be desperately concerned about a deadline breathing down our neck, at least at this stage. So that's the timeline that we're operating to. So what we're currently doing, how we're proceeding, is that Agricovery has initiated this process and is leading the scheme development. It is also funding my involvement and the involvement of its own people and team to get this up and running. There is an element of this that is about feasibility. So I think as we've talked to some of the veterinary medicine companies, there's a sense that this is phenomenally complex. So Agricovery's commitment to be the operator here is somewhat subject to us being able to cobble together something that will actually work. My role is to lead the process, facilitate the design, and work through some of the technical aspects of it to come up with something that will work. And then we have assembled an initial industry advisory group that's meeting next week. I'll talk about that in a moment, to start the process. And one of the first things that we'll do is make sure that we've got all the right people around the table. Obviously, we can't invite every veterinary medicine brand to be part of that advisory group. So I'll take responsibility. I've made an initial call as to the people to involve, but that's a starting point, and we will review that. And it is our intention to go forward and design a scheme based on the guidelines. So we want to avoid deviating from the guidelines unless we absolutely have to, and proceed on that basis. But I think it's important to note that this is a heavily collaborative process. So I have sort of very limited time to apply to this. I certainly can't work on this full time. So it is built into our project plan that that brand owners are assisting with information, potentially with trialing some things. It's going to be a collaborative effort. It's going to require everyone to share the load a little bit. Otherwise, it would be a very, very expensive process to develop independently. So I can't emphasize that enough. We all need to come together and create something that will work for farmers out there and people that are in the sort of user consumer space, but also will work really well for you guys, for the brand owners. Let me just talk briefly about the advisory group. What we're bringing that group together to do is to provide a bit of expertise to help make sure that we really understand the complexities and the realities of the vet med space, particularly as we are coming from herbicides, pesticides, that sort of space, your agricultural chemicals of that nature. So we recognise it's new. We recognise there's a bit of a learning curve to make sure that we don't make assumptions about the vet med space that we shouldn't. In the discussions I've had so far, I think we've been pretty disabused of any notion that the two are the same. I think it's pretty clear. So we're pulling this group together to help guide that process, to help us understand what a scheme should look like. And actually, I'll just note here, I think I've skipped over, also particularly to help us assemble data. That's going to be huge. As I noted earlier, there is a need to levy products. We need to understand what the products are, how we should be categorizing the products, what the packaging looks like, how much of that packaging there is out there. So very early on in the process, we're going to be asking all of you to supply us with information that would help us understand the products, the packaging types, the degree of toxicity of the product, how much packaging there is in each product, what that packaging is made of, all of that sort of stuff. As you can imagine, as we're trying to figure out what to focus on first, we need to know volumes of waste out there. We're also going to need to know what is currently happening with that waste. So we have a baseline. We need to know who is buying the stuff, where it's being used, how it's being used, all of that. That's going to be a big role for brand owners in that space, is to help furnish that information. And we will, of course, build into our design very strident mechanisms for managing that data in an appropriate way. Obviously, that's highly commercially sensitive. So that will be one of the key aspects that the advisory group will wrestle with, as well as figuring out what our criteria is for prioritising products and packaging, so we know where to start. As you can imagine, we cannot just suddenly lurch out there and provide collection or disposal or recycling services for everything. So we need to start somewhere. We need to figure out what the progression is with different products. So the group, as it's currently and initially stands, is there. Tony Wilson from Agricovery's GM, Jeff Howell representing AgCalm, Ed Catherwood representing ARPA and AgriHealth. It says Kirsten, it should be Kristen Baxter. Kristen, if you're on the line, I apologise for that. I did say I would do that. From Zoetis, George Reeves from Elanco, Sam Higgins, MSD, Camilla Burringer, Fraser Hodgson, Furback, and Helen Beattie, who is from New Zealand Veterinary Association. So I would encourage you to have a think about that, whether you want to send me an email saying, hey, look, I think there's some gaps here. As I said, this group is assembling for the first time next week in Auckland to discuss the composition of the group. And we do want to make sure that there is legitimacy for where we end up by making sure that the different levels of interest and needs are represented. Bearing in mind, of course, that a big part of what this group will do will be forming networks out to make sure that the interests of the market really are well represented. I've just got a correction here from Fraser Hodgson, just saying that from Ed Catherwood, just saying Fraser Hodgson actually from Burback will be representing ARPA. Ed Catherwood will be there on behalf of AgriHealth. Is that right, Ed? Hopefully I've got that right from your message.
Yeah, that's correct. So Fraser will be the official ARPA representative, but I'll pop into the next meeting as an observer, if that's right.
Excellent. I will correct that. I will, as someone else has asked there, I will circulate this presentation along with the link to the recording of this presentation so that you have that available to work through. So let me get back on track here. Right, just to give you an idea of how the project is going to proceed, what our indicated timeframes are, and how we are going to kind of work through this. My involvement, as I mentioned, has been funded by Agricovery for the first year. So the need in the first year of the project is to understand the market, start to lay out a bit of a map of the market, of the products, of the waste streams, of the initial behaviours, so we know what's currently happening with medicines, the qualitative and quantitative analysis, the challenges with handling, where the wastes are going, all of that sort of stuff. Understanding users, that's really, really important in a product stewardship scheme. How we could potentially collect these things or provide drop-off. We'll probably do some small-scale pilot trials just to test some of our hypotheses. But where we aim to get to in this first process is a pretty good outline of what the product stewardship scheme will look like, and obviously that will go out for consultation, and then a plan for what is going to be required to move from that space of a pretty good idea to actually having a scheme in place. And that will likely involve some capital investment in machinery for processing. It'll involve contracting. It will involve publicity. There will be all of those mechanisms in place. But it is the intention of Agricovery that beyond year one, once we've sort of got the structure in place, that the industry itself will need to fund whatever happens beyond that point. So Agricovery's commitment is to get it to this point, and as we go, we'll need to figure out what will be required to proceed, and the industry, meaning the brand owners, in a fair and transparent way, will need to provide funding to get the scheme up and running. If I can provide a comment, not on behalf of Agricovery, but my own observation, is bearing in mind, of course, that Agricovery and the money it spends is as a result of levies collected on other types of products. So while it has an interest to step into the space, it needs to be very careful in how it spends those funds in extending the scheme, hence the need to go to some degree, but then to hand over that responsibility to those that are actually participating in the scheme. From my perspective, at least, I think that's quite appropriate. So then beyond year one of the project, then it gets detailed. It's about the logistics, the mechanisms, and aiming to get the scheme up and running. Now, ideally, if, depending on what we find, you could potentially have the scheme operating by the end of year two. I think that is honestly probably pretty optimistic. I would also say that it is likely that certain products will be added to the scheme over time, hence the need to prioritise them. If one was trying to project a date in which every vet med product in New Zealand was incorporated in the scheme, I suspect that's a little further out, given the number of product lines. So there will be, no doubt, a process that determines where the focus should be, where the priorities are, and we'll move in that direction. Some of the issues and challenges that have been quickly identified in this process, and I think it's important that we're all pretty upfront and comfortable with these. This is a complex space. As I mentioned earlier, this has been made clear to me in no uncertain terms that there's a lot of complexity in the space. There's a lot of brand owners, there's a lot of products. And unlike most agrochemicals, where the chemicals are in an HDPE container that all looks fairly similar and can be triple rinsed and recycled, the number of material types in use in vet meds we know is quite substantial. That products may have primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging, each of different material types or multiple material types. So this is not the same and will be pretty challenging. We also know that, whereas in agrochemicals, that the users tend to be either farmers themselves or contractors, we know that there are a range of different users at different scales, at different points of the market, different channels to market. Again, that adds complexity. Veterinary medicines as a definition is pretty broad, and we're going to need to seek guidance from government as to the intention there, or more realistically provide guidance to the government as to how that should be defined. And I mentioned small pets already. I think that's probably not within scope, but we'll need to figure that out. We know we have a lot of product lines. I haven't worked my way through ACVM, and it's not clear to me necessarily which products are going to be in scope and out of scope, but certainly we have hundreds of distinct products, if not more. It will be interesting to see. Certainly, I have a lack of knowledge on how this waste is currently being managed. It'll be interesting to see as we bring the group together and call upon you all for information in that space, how much we know about how the waste is currently being managed. That will be quite important. And also the hazardous nature of some of the products and handling them. I do want to say here, and I'll probably end up having put this on a later slide, but I'll mention it now anyway. One should not conflate product stewardship with recycling. There will be products that we come across that we will not be recycling, that will be unsafe or inappropriate to recycle. Our goal here is to safely and appropriately manage waste as high up the waste hierarchy as we can. But it's likely that straight out disposal or incineration or whatever will be the pathway for at least some of the products, and that's okay. I don't think the intention is that we bankrupt a whole bunch of companies trying to achieve recycling when it's just not feasible. That's not the intention. And certainly it would be pretty challenging with some of the things in this space. Well, I did say it would be on a future slide. There you go. Recycling may not be the goal. Some of the other, more challenging details is that of free riders. So as we progress with this design process, and particularly in year 2, it's likely that there will be some funding sought from brand owners to develop the scheme to the point of launch. And some brand owners may elect not to participate in that. There's no regulatory lever to make brand owners participate in the development of a scheme. So should the scheme launch, and some brand owners have contributed to its funding and some brand owners have not, we need to decide as a group how that will be dealt with. There are mechanisms, an entry fee or something of that kind, but that's a particular hook in this space that we need to be aware of. I've already mentioned that we need to decide as numerous parties handle vet needs along the supply chain, we need to decide who will pay levies. I think that's probably the ACVM registrant, but we'll need to decide that. And then, and this gives me nightmares at this stage, understand the complexity. What will the levies actually look like? How will they be structured? How will they recognise and accommodate the different types of products and the different types of packaging? And just as an example, this is the levy structure that I developed that's going to be launched shortly for Agricovery for its existing programs. Currently, there is a standard levy on everything, but as we move towards regulated product stewardship, we recognise that that's no longer sufficient. So instead, you end up with a matrix like this that has two components. One is a levy on the container, and recognising the costs of recycling the container. That's along the top, and then one is on the chemical itself, recognising that a dairy detergent is a different prospect than some of the sort of nasty chemicals that need to be shipped to France for disposal. So there is a graduated levy to reflect the challenges in disposal. That is exactly what is required by the guidelines. So I put this forward as just a starting point, but it's likely that the levies that we end up with for veterinary medicines will look like that, although I fear the table may have a few more columns and rows by the time we finish up, in order to reflect the diversity of chemicals that we're dealing with. So just finally, in terms of where to from here, obviously this is a high-speed briefing, and we'll provide information to do a bit more background reading. I'm also happy, you should all have my email, but if you don't, I can provide it to answer any questions that you have, and we'll do an open Q&A session shortly. But we're meeting together on the 22nd of April. We want to make sure that we've got the advisory group right. We want to start thinking about how we're going to categorise and prioritise products that will guide both our development process and help us to start thinking about what levy is going to look like. We need to start fairly urgently gathering the sales and the product packaging data that I referenced. Recognise that some of you are not going to be able to turn out that data in a week, so we want to give sufficient lead time to assemble that. Excuse me. We want to start to gather information on what's currently happening with the waste and how it's managed. We want to talk about product trials, things that are already being looked at, and things that we may want to prioritise looking at, and then think about the communication process. And that's a two-way thing, both letting you all know what we're doing, because obviously, if it's not clear by now, I certainly hope it is, this stuff will affect your business. And so we need to treat that with sensitivity and recognise that this is a big, it's a big thing. It's a big change. So we want to make sure that we're very good at communicating what is happening, but also that we're listening and consulting and making sure that we bring in all the information that we need about the different brands and how they operate at different scales. So that will also be a real focus of the advisory group, is to be a conduit for all of that communication. So, in record time and a record pace, I think that's all I have to say as a briefing. So want to really just open it up now, and I'll turn this off if that works. Yeah, just to open it up for questions. If your question is a bit more sensitive or a bit more involved, I'm happy to take that offline. But if you think you have a question that may be relevant, please do ask it now. We have a bit of time now to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, hi. I hope you can hear me. It's Samantha Gray here. I'm from the I'm representing the Natural Health Products New Zealand Industry Association. And so, hi. So my question is around whether products that are covered by ACVM legislation but not registered would be included, such as oral nutritional compounds and those sorts of products.
Yeah, that has specifically come up, Samantha, in our discussion so far, is while the definition says that it is not limited to products that are ACM registered, we're going to need to, put together some, as the advisory group, we're going to need to put together a query back to the Ministry for the Environment and ask, hang on, is this included? Is this included? I can kind of preempt that by, I'll say I'm about 70% sure that the response will be, well, do you as an industry think it should be included? And so we'll need to make some call on that. My perspective on it would be, look, if it makes sense for some of those things to be included, if, for example, they have packaging that's similar, or packaging in general, the kind of packaging that the ministry is keen to capture in this, then it may be that they're included, but that we reflect the difference in the products based on the levy structure. So as with, taking it back into Agricovery's current programs, dairy detergents have not sort of historically been, or those that make them have not really participated extensively in Agricovery's programs, because dairy detergents are very different than Roundup. They are just, they're like a detergent, like a soap. So the way that Agricovery is accounted for that is to drastically discount the levy that those that provide those products would pay, to reflect the fact that, well, the packaging still needs to be recycled, but the contents are, pretty innocuous. So it could be that we set something like, somewhere in that space. But because I'm not, at this stage, particularly intimately familiar with the products, I think that's a discussion that the advisory group would want to have, and I think would welcome submissions on the issue as to, how you think we should grapple with that.
Okay, so you'd like us, if we think that it could be an issue for our members, are you saying that you'd like us to make a submission to your advisory group? Is that? Yeah,
submission's probably that sounds too formal, but I any perspective you have on any of this, I would welcome you sending me an email, anything you would like us to know to make sure is represented in the sort of topics of discussion. I think that kind of open flow of information, and hey, please do make sure this is raised. I've already received a few of those. I personally would welcome them. I think it's important for us to, whatever concerns you as you hear this stuff, it's important that the advisory group does grapple with that.
Yeah, and so will you then try and get clarity from the relevant government officials? Yeah.
Once we've got an idea of the questions that we need to be asking, and what the concerns are, then I will go back to the person I'm connected with at NFE that's responsible for the space and say, please, can you give us guidance on this? But like I say, they may not have the answers, and they may ask the industry to make some call or recommendation on it for further discussion. So I'm just alerting everyone to the fact that the ministry does not have deep expertise in all of these spaces either. And they have been quite collaborative to say, hey, look, we don't want to just make a call, and there is a degree of trust, I think, in the industries, and a recognition that because the product stewardship schemes are being operated by representative non-profits, that a bit of a dialogue can be begun to sort these things out.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Thank you. I have a question here. Well, actually, I'm not sure if the person wants me to read it out or not, so I will let the person speak who's given a chat question, although Ed does note that upper members can communicate any feedback or concerns to Fraser Hodgson or Ed, who will attend the meeting next week. So, in terms of you're a member, I guess, of AgCom or APA, if you would prefer your concerns to be represented by those organisations, please do communicate them to those representatives, I think that's quite a good idea. But I'm happy to take them as well. Let's just make sure the concerns are heard. Any other questions? I will address the question sort of obliquely that's been asked. Is, you know, one of the real concerns with this is around sales, market share data, and the question's been asked is, given that data is already provided through the ACDM, can ACDM anonymise that data and then provide it on to Agricovery? Look, I think if that's possible, anything that gives brands comfort around the sensitivity of that data, that'd be great. My understanding is that, and I did attend a meeting with the manager of the ACDM database, is that is not a straightforward exercise. I think, to put it mildly, it was our hope that we could sort of integrate that data into the Agricovery online system, and we've done that to a degree, but really only on products that are registered or deregistered. I don't think accessing any kind of data on sales volumes was a possibility. So it will be one of the key topics of conversation at the advisory group to say, look, what is the best way to do this? And it depends on whether or not Agricovery, is going to be the scheme provider, the scheme manager, the scheme governance layer, because as an independent non-profit, that makes it a little easier for them to do it. The other option may be that as an independent consultant, that I sign NDAs with each of the brands and manage the data completely independently until that scheme provider is appointed, or something else. But it will definitely be something we'll need to discuss, and for everyone to be comfortable with it, because without that data, it will be impossible to design a meaningful scheme. We just won't know what we're playing with.
Hi, it's Natalie from Phoenix Farm. Just one thought I had: if you are looking for continual improvement in terms of packaging, it would be very useful for us to know what kinds of materials are more easily disposed of or recycled. Otherwise, we can't feed that back up.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent comment, actually. And some of the other work I do in the product stewardship space, I fairly consistently get that comment that people are willing to make alternative packaging choices, but don't know what packaging to choose. That problem is exacerbated by the fact that in different places, different packaging can be recycled. Polypropylene is a great example. In some parts of the country, that can be recycled. In other parts, it can't. Albeit that as a national program, Agricovery can sort of aggregate volumes and direct them. So I think we can lay our hands on some pretty good information in that regard, and that should be one of the functions of the scheme, is to be constantly feeding that information. In fact, it's part of the guidelines, is that information is constantly being fed back out to the brand owners, saying, hey, when you make this the stuff out of this, it's really hard to deal with. One of the things I have found in the work I've done recently for a large recycling outfit is that as single-use plastics have become a bit of a monster and a bit demonized, a lot of companies are moving towards cardboard packaging. In fact, New Zealand has a far bigger problem with cardboard than it does with most plastics. So that's kind of a perverse outcome of that. And I've just finished a big project for the Ministry of the Environment saying, heck, what are we going to do about cardboard, because it's become such a massive issue. So that's fundamentally about the issue that you're raising, Natalie, which is people don't necessarily have good information, and so make reasonable decisions on what they have. So we will make sure that the scheme feeds that information back out and keeps it relevant, because it's not constant either, just to make it more difficult.
think one comment I have on the packaging as well, because with registered products, the packaging is part of the registration. So if you change anything, yeah.
That does make it easy. And I mean, it is also the degree to which brands can influence, if they're not the manufacturer, can influence changes in packaging. I think that is understood, and so the scheme and its governance will need to be realistic about that. That for some products where we might be importing a few thousand units, we're probably not going to be able to demand that the manufacturer, wherever it might be, changes the packaging just for New Zealand. So there's a level of pragmatism and realism that needs to be built into it. Any other questions from anyone?
Hi, it's me again. One more question. One thought is, if people have product left in their packaging, that complicates how you dispose of it.
It will. It becomes then a two-tier kind of process. You have to manage the material separately to the packaging. This is very much how it works in the agrochemical space. That's why there's two different levies for what's in the package and in the package itself. And indeed for agrochemicals, it's agrochemicals and their containers dealt with as two separate things. It's less of a problem if the material is in the original packaging. It gets very complex indeed, or rather very expensive when the material is decanted into secondary packaging. So you have a big bucket of it, you pour it into something, and one no longer knows if that's if what's on the tin is what's inside the tin. In that case, you then need to treat the chemical as kind of the worst case scenario. That happens a lot in agrochemicals because it's not technically or financially feasible to test them. So you've just got to assume it's something really bad. So that's one of the things that we'll want to feed back out, not just to brand owners but to users, is to say, hey, keep your stuff in the original container. That helps. I'm not sure how big of that may not be an issue within veterinary. I guess we'll find that out. But historically it's been quite an issue with agrochemicals, particularly when they're bought in bulk. Okay. Unless there's any other questions, Tony, I don't know if you've got any closing thoughts. Otherwise, we might bring it to a conclusion, and then we'll arrange. I'm just trying to think of the best way to get out to you. Perhaps I can just PDF and email my presentation and a link to where you can review this, the video of this. That will also have my email on if you want to ask any questions. Tony, do you have any final comments, and then we can perhaps bring it to a close?
Yeah, well, thank you, Fraser. Yeah, I was just thinking we'll get the presentation and the recording of this put up onto our webpage. So we'll find it there, and we'll have a little area there where we can put all the notes and bits and pieces in there as we go through this process as well. So there's a nice point for people to go to and get all that information. But the only thing from me, Fraser, thank you for the presentation today, and thank you for all the participants and the questions that everyone's put up. It is a journey. We don't have the answers, and we really look forward to coming up with a new product stewardship scheme.
Excellent. Tony, will you make it fairly obvious if people go to the Agricovery website, which is agricovery.co.nz, or is it .org.nz?
Both of them will take you to the website.
Excellent. So it'll be fairly obvious then where they can find what they need?
I'll have to work with the comms person, but we'll look at getting a page set up and a link in there, so it'll have all the area that they go to in there. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Tony, and yeah, thanks everyone. Let us know this is the beginning of a lengthy, possibly, and challenging journey, but I think this will be great for consumers. It's good for the country, and I think it will be good for the industry. But we will no doubt hit a few speed bumps along the way. So I would ask for your patience and forbearance as we figure it out and make sure that we come up with something that works really well. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fraser.
Thank you.